Hello. In this final video, we explore a more complex policymaking process. In our first two videos, we analyzed policy change within the context of a single political institution and found that the pivotal politician depends upon the collective action rules governing the process. In this video, we analyze a setting when multiple political institutions interact to determine policy. In particular, we explore the implications of regulators making policy in a context where elected politicians can overturn their decisions. While elected politicians typically have legislative powers to pass new statutes and laws, regulators are delegated authority from elected politicians to define the details and implement these laws. For example, within the United States, public utility regulators determine the price of electricity. In France, the Ministry of Ecology, Sustainable Development and Energy define the details of policy affecting the environment. Please note that the model we develop in this video can be adapted to fit any political environment where there are checks and balances on policymaking power. Furthermore, we can use this type of model to provide insight into political strategy. The following model is based upon a number of my published articles co-authored with Guy Holborn. The model explicitly captures the interaction among regulators and elected politicians in other political institutions that also have policy-making authority. For the purposes of this example, assume regulators are delegated authority to define the social cost of carbon for a carbon tax. But the legislative and executive branch of government can overturn the policy by voting for a new statute. We model this as a multi-step strategic game between the three political institutions. In step one, the regulators define the social cost of carbon for the carbon tax. Often there are many regulators sitting on a regulatory commission and voting on a policy choice. We'll assume a simple majority rule. Thus, the median voter is pivotal. Assume the median voter has an ideal social cost of carbon of $60 per ton of CO2 emissions. The objective of the median voter is to define the social cost of carbon as close to $60 as possible. After the regulator makes its decision, in step two, the legislature can decide whether to overturn the regulator by passing a new law. With simple majority voting, the median voter in the legislature is pivotal. Assume that the ideal policy of the median voter is $40 per ton of CO2. For the legislator's proposed policy to overturn the regulator's step one decision, the executive must also vote for the alternative. This is step three. The executive is one person, for example, a president or a governor, and we'll assume their ideal social cost of carbon is $50. Note that both the legislature and the executive must agree on an alternative to overturn the regulator, otherwise the regulator's policy decision stands. But at the same time, the legislature and executive do not have to approve the regulator's decision. If the legislature and executive do nothing, the regulator's policy decision stands. Here is a graphic of the political context we just described. You can see the ideal points of the various pivotal politicians arrayed along the single-dimensional policy space representing the social cost of carbon. One goal from developing such a model is to answer the positive question, what is the equilibrium policy that emerges from this process? We will use backward induction to derive the equilibrium. This means that to understand what social cost of carbon the regulator will choose, we first analyze the expected decisions of the executive in step three and the legislature in step two. Of course, each of the pivotal politicians would like to see the social cost of carbon defined as close to their ideal as possible. So an obvious place to start the analysis is to ask, will the regulator define the social cost of carbon at the pivotal regulator's ideal of $60? $60 would be an equilibrium if we analyze the regulator in isolation. But is this still an equilibrium choice when the regulator can be overturned by other political institutions? To answer this question, first the regulator considers the step three decision by the executive. By including the utility function of the executive in the graph, we can see that there are many alternatives that the executive would prefer to a social cost of carbon of $60. Based upon this utility function, the gray area captures all the alternative policies that the executive would prefer. So any policy proposal from about $41 up to about $59 will be signed and approved by the executive and will overturn the regulator's $60 choice. Moving to step 2, given the executive's set of preferred alternatives, the legislature is predicted to propose an alternative that is as close to the pivotal politician's ideal as possible and still get the approval of the executive. In this example, it looks like the legislature will propose an alternative close to $41, and the executive will approve the proposal. So in step 1, given the expected response by the legislature and executive, a choice of $60 is not advisable for the regulator since it is not a stable equilibrium. While $60 would maximize the utility of the pivotal regulator, it will not be a stable outcome. It will be overturned, and the resulting social cost of carbon of about $41 will be much further from the pivotal regulator's ideal. Using a similar process, we could see that $59 or $58 or $57 are also not equilibrium choices for the regulator. So what is? It is fairly straightforward to see which policy choice will be made by the regulator in stage 1. Given the threat posed by the legislature and executive, the regulator chooses a policy of $50. This is as close to the pivotal regulator's ideal as possible without being overturned. X star subscript R represents the equilibrium. It will not be overturned even though the legislature prefers policies closer to the pivotal legislator's ideal of $40. $50 won't be overturned because the executive will veto any alternative proposal. In this political environment, we can see that the executive represents a constraint on the decision of the regulator. We can think of the executive branch of government as the pivotal political institution in this political context. Consider one change in the model. The institutional rules governing the regulatory process are the same, but assume the distribution of ideal points within the regulatory commission differs, such that the median voter within the regulatory commission has an ideal policy of $45. This is a different political environment and leads to a change in the equilibrium. Here, the regulator can define the social cost of carbon at its ideal, and this will be a stable equilibrium. Any alternative proposed by the legislator that moves closer to $40 will be vetoed by the executive. In contrast to the previous political context, here the regulator is not constrained by the other two branches of government from achieving its ideal. In essence, the regulators are the pivotal political institution. One insight that comes out of this analysis is that in a political system with checks and balances, the constraints on decision-making differ depending upon the details of the political context. These constraints affect which political institution is pivotal. In the first example, the executive branch is the pivotal political institution, while in the second, the regulators are pivotal. These models have implications for political strategy. For interest groups which would like to influence the policy outcome on the margin, they must first target the pivotal political institution. In the first example model, it won't help the interest group to target the regulator on the margin because the regulator will still be constrained by the executive. Similarly, the interest group won't target the legislature. So the prediction that comes out of this model is that the interest groups will likely first target the executive branch. This adds to the insight from the first two videos. While the model predicts that an interest group will target the pivotal political institution, within that single institution, the interest groups will first target the pivotal politician. Thank you for watching these 3 videos. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to PPT and political strategy.